All right. Dialogue highlight focus session 2 has a theme that has not changed. That is, how might the West best act and aid Ukraine in its present hour of need? Yep, it's still, the microphone is still not working.
I hear it. I'm fine.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Our session that starts the afternoon for us is how might the West best aid Ukraine in its present hour of need? And we had a third guest that was going to be with us, Ambassador Markarova, but she and the DCM have been called to the White House at this moment. They're at the White House at this moment. So they excused themselves.
They can't hear you, Walter. Turn the volume up.
But I'm in the microphone. I'm holding it. If I put it in my mouth.
Fine.
You mean to tell me you can't hear me back there? I can. Yeah. It's not on. Okay. Is it on? Now it's on. Now it's on. Can you hear me now? Okay. You see, it's on. The Russians have been working overtime. They're next door. So anyway, I'm just kidding. That was the ambassador's thing. Anyway, this session is very, very important because it does deal with that very important topic of how the West may best aid Ukraine. In that case, we used to say how the U.S. would best aid. At this point in time, we've decided, man, we've broadened this, and the two individuals that will be talking to this, both are quite capable of that. The person that I'm going to be introducing, who will be leading the discussion with James Sherr of Britain, is Tom McDevitt. And I just wanted to underline that Tom McDevitt, in his role as chair of the Washington Times, has done actually yeoman's work in keeping the eye on what makes America really great. He has kept his eye on those strategic points around the world, and he's mentioned them to me, and I'll let him mention it further, that are critical for keeping the United States, that sort of guardian angel that has helped us win one, win two, and the Cold War. And right now, the world's in a deep mess, and it may need the United States to play that role again. And it's questioning that role. So Tom is going to open. He will pass it to Jim, and then he will also speak. So sorry that we don't have the ambassador, but these two will certainly make up for that. Okay, Tom, it's all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Walter. The round of applause is for Walter, not for me. I am so impressed with the incredible work that he has done. I just got to know Walter this past week. And congratulations to all of you for being here. How could we possibly have planned for a more opportune moment? Hopefully, President Zelensky will be visiting down the street in a couple days, or however that works out. I do want to say that on the way to our earlier meetings, I got a call from the Deputy Ambassador, Dennis, and he apologized on behalf of Ambassador Makarov, who was, as Walter said, called to the White House for obvious reasons. And she conveyed her heartfelt concern and wants to stay in tune with what's going on here. And I hope to meet her on behalf of the Washington Times sometime later this week. I also want to recognize a person so critical in my life in this battle, along with other parts of the world, and that is my beloved wife, Chofin McDevitt, who's here with me. Chofin was born in Taiwan. Chofin, honey, stand up. She was classically trained in Vienna, Austria, in piano. So we have a grand piano in our living room. So our romantic experiences these days is tuning into Fox, maybe having a glass of red wine, and then she goes to the piano and plays, and I'm so happy. But also, so thank you, honey, for being here. I also wanted to draw attention to our good friend, mutual friend, Ambassador Roman Popaduke, who under George H.W. Bush was assigned as the ambassador to Ukraine from the United States. Roman is a dear friend. We've known each other for 20-some years when he was directing the Bush Library, and the Washington Times Foundation participated with that quite a bit. So, so with that, I want to get right to the point. Number one, Ya lubię Ukraine. Thank you for my Ukrainian language lesson. We have a very distinguished speaker coming up, but I want to take just a couple of minutes to point out what the Washington Times and our affiliated groups are interested in. And that has to do with the overall global situation. And we're standing up a new project called the Global Freedom Initiative, in which Ukraine plays a key role, along with Taiwan, as well as the Korea Peninsula, Venezuela, reform in Nigeria, some other hotspots around the world. And the essence of our focus is really the role, in my view, the role of media in reaching and informing citizens. So just as General Breedlove mentioned at the end of the last session, which I think was such an important point, that the key to this, notwithstanding the amazing content you had this morning on military tactics and tools, the key to the whole thing is policy. And the essence of policy is driven by vision, and the guts and the power behind that are citizens. Even though we have a dramatic, powerful personality now, thank goodness, in the White House, dramatic, powerful, and a personality. Behind it all is the power and role of citizens and the core vision and principle and essence of America. Therefore, the orientation I'm taking is really in the domain of information operations, cognitive warfare, ideological work, but essentially it's strategic communications. So we're standing up an integrated strategy platform dealing with keeping Taiwan free. Second, Ukraine, rebuilding Ukraine. Third, taking back Venezuela, reforming Nigeria, etc. The whole focus of this is aggregating content, convening experts and citizens, and producing content that people can use to find their voice in this critical time. No matter how dramatic Fox News or CNN or anyone else is at night to keep us all paying attention to every minute of what happens in the White House. At the ground level is the role of people and voters and citizens, and that's our orientation to drive policy. So with that, it is my honor to introduce a new friend who is coming to us from overseas in the United Kingdom. And he has his bio, of course, is in the program, but I'm going to refer to it because we're really going to hear from a distinguished gentleman who has every right and background to do the keynote here, all right? And that's James Sherr, OBE, currently a senior fellow of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, attached to the International Center for Defense and Security in Tallinn. Immediately prior, he was associate fellow in the Royal Institute of International Affairs, the famous Chatham House, where he headed the Russian Eurasia program between 2008 and 11. Earlier, he served as a member of the Social Studies faculty of Oxford University from 1993 to 2012, a fellow of the Conflict Studies Research Center of the UK Ministry of Defence from 1995 to 08, and a director of studies of the Royal United Services Institute from 83 to 85. What an amazing background, such tremendous expertise and wisdom there. And so we are delighted to introduce Sir James Sherr. That's the only time I will use it. That's the only time because Walter told me, but James informed me not to say that, which I wanted to just tell the story. But it is an honor to be with you, sir, and the floor. He's going to give you really a keynote address. And then, Walter, if it'd be okay, I'll make a couple quick comments, but let's open it up to the floor and let's grow together in a conversation with such an expert to develop the future. Okay, let's give a warm round of applause to our keynote speaker, James Sherr. James, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much for that embarrassingly flattering introduction. The reason I insist you not call me Sir James is because I'm not Sir James. I'm not being modest. I'm simply being accurate. To receive an order that entitles one to a knighthood, it has to have a K before it. So I'm far removed from that. I'm very sad not to be with all of you. I can already see many friends in the audience, and I am very jealous. What I could say at the outset is that if you, like me, were fortunate enough to listen to Phillips O'Brien this morning, you will have had your inoculation. So I'm now going to give you another booster shot, and hopefully I will not mince words either. By the way, I'm speaking to you from Estonia. I've been living here for 6 years, and so during that time I have been spending as much time in Poland and Lithuania as in the UK, which I certainly have no intention of deserting. Coming back to what Tom said a moment ago, war is a tool of policy. If we don't know the baseline of political realism, we will not be able to construct a baseline of military realism either. For over 100 years, in most of Europe and much of the world, the United States has been seen as a force for good in the world. Within the past month, in much, I would say most of Europe, and I am certainly including the staunchest allies of the United States, that certainty has been rudely shaken. And sitting in Washington, it would be very easy to underestimate this. I would modestly advise you not to underestimate the sense of change that has been and is being felt here. It is very difficult to see, looking at steps that have been taken, statements that have been made, that this administration regards Europe as an equal or that it takes Europe seriously. It certainly is not going to be given a place at the negotiating table with Russia. There's ample indication that Europe is not taken seriously either as an indispensable ally or as a force in its own right. Now, to some in Europe, these changes, and we're only speaking about only a few weeks have passed since Donald Trump's inauguration as 47th president. To some, these changes are merely seen as serious. To others, and I myself am one, I confess, they are seen as systemic. Some believe what we're looking at is an abrupt change in policy. There are others, people known well to many of you, who regard what we are seeing now in the United States as a regime change, and believe that we are looking at a process which is only beginning. The obvious question in these circumstances, at least the circumstances that are perceived here, is what can NATO's European allies do and what must they do? And the radical question, which is certainly being posed in every forum I attend, is whether Europe can substitute and not merely supplement the capabilities of the United States. Now, my own view, for reasons I am not going to be able to explain, it's a half hour, it's worth an hour's, easily an hour's discussion in itself, But in the long term, I believe, if we mean over the next 10 to 15 years, the answer is yes. It's very easy today, very easy for people of this generation, even to some extent the previous generation, to remember what Europe was like during the Cold War and the level of its defense-mindedness during the Cold War. In 1970, which was certainly not the worst period of the Cold War, the United Kingdom devoted 5.4% of its GDP on defense, and during the Falklands operation, about which many lessons can be drawn, the percentage was notably higher. But then let's ask a second question, and I will not further elaborate on what I've said, though I can. But let's ask a second question. Is Europe going to be able to summon and generate the capabilities needed in the time these capabilities are likely to be needed in Ukraine and elsewhere? And my answer to that, and I'm reflecting a depressingly broad consensus, is no, there is scant chance of it. And that is the problem we face. Consider, if you will, the question of the 30,000 man European reassurance force, the very force that was under discussion, has been under discussion between Emmanuel Macron and our Prime Minister Keir Starmer in Paris recently, and that Macron even more recently. I'm sorry? Should I
Go ahead.
stop?
We're,
Okay. All
no,
right.
no, we can, fine, sir.
All right. That's
James, we can hear you fine.
President Macron only on Monday presented these ideas to President Trump, and Keir Starmer intends to do so on Thursday. Well, we have to ask some very bracing questions. Is this force we are talking about now necessarily in vague terms? Is it meant to be a peacekeeping force, or is it meant to be a deterrence force? Well, when you consider what's being discussed, it's clearly meant to be a deterrent force. Is this deterrent force meant to be deployed as a constituent part of a peace settlement, that is to say, as something that has been agreed with Russia, or not? Forgive me, but I would be very confident in saying such a force, a deterrent force, a capable deterrent force, simply will not be deployed with Russian consent. And the sooner we understand that, the better. I don't exclude that Putin will consent to the Europeans being deployed in a much larger, less defined force, including many including many friends of Russia and allies of Russia, that will have no military coherence whatsoever. That I don't exclude. But if you're talking about a European force to uphold a peace settlement in Ukraine, I think there's more chance of one of the virtual objects I am looking at knocking me dead where I sit than there is that the Russians are going to consent to it. Well, then, is it going to be deployed without Russian consent? Will it be deployed in the face of opposition by Russia? Well, in that case, it would need very serious capabilities, the kind recently set out by Ben Hodges and a number of other people, but we have Ben's recent article in the Wall Street Journal, and he outlines the capabilities he has in mind, though he's focusing purely on the conventional end. Even at the conventional end, most of that capability, airlift, for example, intelligence comes from the United States. But because Russia is a nuclear superpower, there needs to be a capable nuclear deterrent force as well. And at present, the only deterrent force that exists in Europe are national forces that are designed to deter, protect the United Kingdom and France against attacks on national territory, or they have a more extended function as part of a wider NATO force, which necessarily includes and is dominated by the United States. So such a force and such a guarantee can only be provided by the United States. And Keir Starmer has left no one in any doubt. He said that his proposal to deploy a European deterrent force, reassurance force in Ukraine, rests upon the premise of a US nuclear guarantee. Will Donald Trump agree to that? Well, I personally see no sign of it. What he said to Emmanuel Macron when the point was raised on Monday is that he should not worry excessively because he has every expectation that Vladimir Putin will honor any agreement he signs. Well, I don't know any informed person in Europe who shares that expectation. Moreover, so the point being, if there is to be a European force, it has to pass certain tests of seriousness. There are certain preconditions to its seriousness, political and military. There is little sign of them being present, at least at present. And I did not even mention Poland. Poland, as many of you know, has the largest, and certainly one of 2 or 3 most capable ground forces in Europe, 100,000 strong. Poland is adamantly opposed to such a deployment and will not take part in it. And it is in the state of the greatest uneasiness, in some quarters panic, about what has been taking place of late. A panic actually enhanced by the visit of President Duda to Trump, not diminished. Because of it. And for a very simple historical and geographical reason. The geographical reason is that Poland lies between Russia and Germany. Who have been Poland's historical enemies? Without exception, Russia and Germany, despite the relationship that exists today. But the Polish relationship which exists with Germany today, which is very comprehensive and very positive, exists in the context of NATO, which is an entity underpinned by the United States. The prospect of Poland finding itself in a European alliance that does not include the United States is unthinkable. And that is why the mood in Poland has become very dark in a very short period of time. But these are the kind of changes in Europe taking place. I think what that suggests in present, what that suggests in the near future, is not something very encouraging. It suggests enormous confusion, stress, toil, and will require serious concentrated effort on the part of Europeans to be able to contrive anything that will be enduring and constructive from all of this. So on that very cheerful note, I'll stop talking and turn things over to you for comments and questions.
Thank you very much, James. I want to let you know that we lost a couple of minutes, I guess, from the very beginning, but I'm told that that was captured in live stream and recorded, so all of us can watch the entirety of James' comments later, okay? So thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor, I think, for questions, comments, very brief. We have a mic here, so let's start. Why don't we take the question in the back there? And please give us your name and organization or affiliation and speak into the microphone.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for taking the time to be here. My name is Taras Mitrofanyuk. I'm here as a part of the American Ukraine Youth Association, which is a member of the Ukrainian Congressional Committee of America. My question from earlier still stands. what do you think about the prevalence of disinformation and its impact on world leaders and the way that they frame national conflicts? Thank you.
James, did you get that?
I did get that.
Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, the Russian narrative about Ukraine and about the war has been extremely influential. And you could look at this at two levels. You could look at Russia's entire infrastructure of disinformation and activities of disinformation and the resources going into it. Or you could look at something else, which I personally think is more important. You could look at Western ignorance. The fact is, this administration is not alone. The further countries are from Ukraine, the less they know about it. The less they know about its identity, its culture, its history. The Russian narrative about these things has, I have to say, it's been the narrative which has prevailed in some of the best universities that I have been to in the course of my education. Why? Because it's simple. And there's another reason why. Because so many of the Russia experts we have had are really the experts in the Soviet Union who called themselves Sovietologists. They were Russia experts. They generally looked at Ukraine from the vantage point of Moscow, even if they regarded the Soviet Union as a totalitarian state, an adversary, and a very harsh regime. They did not have a real basis for understanding Ukraine in its own light. How are they going to acquire that? So we're starting from a baseline of alarming ignorance. There's been an enormous degree of progress since 2014, particularly since 2022, but it is still very much an uphill struggle. So I think the influence of the Russian perspective, the Russian narrative on all these questions is something that cannot be readily overestimated. And thank you for that question. It's very important.
I'd like to pose, let's go over here. Yes, sir.
Jamie, I must admit that I'm telling the logic according to which anybody responsible, not only in Europe, but in the world, should consult this international criminal, murder, and gangster, what he would allow on the front line as a peacekeeper, deterrent force, or anything else. Just why this topic ever we are discussing? Why ever we're discussing the idea of ceasefire? One of conclusions, as Glenn has, with Igor, has described to us at earlier session, would change dramatically, could change dramatically balance of power in the Black Sea in a very short period of time. And we definitely know that it might happen on the land front and the Air Force and everywhere. So why the idea is just to bring all benefits from this bloody war to the aggressor.
Am I speaking to Andrei?
Instead of doing the point, why just we, these discussions are given, we turn the topic of this session is West aid. And I'd like to understand West aid to whom? To victim of aggression or to aggressor?
Thank you.
We're discussing these things because these things are part of the policies of Western governments, and so we are obliged to discuss them. And as you can see, I am not applauding. I am raising some very sharp. I'm hoping to raise some very sharp and penetrating questions about the realism of this entire undertaking at every conceivable level. So I don't want to simply restate your own rhetorical questions. Now, unfortunately, we have been handicapped. And this is the baseline for the new administration in the United States. We have been handicapped, in my view, by the fact that the Biden administration was handed a winning hand in this war and didn't play it. It demonstrated it neither knew how to deter war or how to enable Ukraine to prosecute it successfully. That understandably has created a strong sentiment in the United States that this is becoming a forever war whose purpose has not been, whose objective has not been properly articulated, with no end in sight. And that in turn has led to all kinds of misconceptions about the feasibility of defeating Russia in this war, which even now, I think, and I think I'm echoing what was said by more than one speaker in the opening panel here, which even now is a very realistic process. I would just ask you to look at the Prigozhin mutiny that we saw. Why did this happen? It didn't happen because Prigozhin and his troops and other troops who were and other elements of the armed forces who were supporting him believed, as most Western commentators believe, that Russia was winning. They believed because they felt that Russia's strategy was ham-handed and catastrophic and that Russia was on the point of defeat. If the Russian army is really broken, we will have something, Putin will have something much bigger to worry about than a replay of the Prigozhin mutiny. I fully second the view that Russia is more readily defeatable than most people seem to imagine. It's very difficult to get this across in an information environment in the United States and other countries that gives outside influence to those who insist that Russia cannot be defeated. This is a mantra, it's a mythology. My God, we could sit here very easily in a few seconds and identify those wars in which Russia has been catastrophically defeated, and every time Russia has been defeated, the result has been one form or another of regime change in Russia. But now we are told that Russia cannot be defeated, despite any lack of convincing evidence to this, in this regard. Andrea, I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time.
I'm sorry.
Walter, I think
Just one question, and that is
we have to make
one comment on Marz and the fact of the coming of a German who seems
Yes.
more dedicated about things than the rest in the German government had been. Does that change the dynamic of a Germany along with a French and English presence? That may change the dynamic. That's a very interesting new presence. Those three have been at each other's necks for a while. The fact is that now the three of them aligned in the same direction might be interesting. Yes or no?
we've got
With
a
Marz.
brief response.
Yes, a very
Brief response.
very brief response. It's very refreshing and encouraging. And you might not have noticed, not all of you might have noticed, that Merz itself has initiated discussions about relaunching discussions which Macron originally initiated about a form of joint nuclear force between the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, a full revival of nuclear sharing agreements in the Cold War. And may I just say that with the addition, with the return of a theater nuclear component to European forces, one starts to see the beginning of some kind of minimal deterrent that would make sense. So it's very impressive to see Merz pushing this, but he's also been very realistic and has said at the very initial meetings to discuss a European force in Paris, he said, in today's conditions, without a US guarantee, this is complete silliness. Well, Scholz said that, but Merz has said he agrees. So we have some distance to travel before we get to that point. But Walter, I fully agree with you. I think it's a very encouraging development, despite the continuing and ominous strength of the far right and far left in Germany.
To be able to lead this discussion, and someone been doing this for many years for us, and certainly with all the organizations he's been associated with, whether Jamestown or SIPA and so on. And that is the incomparable Janusz Bugajski.
Thank you.
Janusz, it's all yours.
Okay. Thanks for that introduction, Walter.
Adrian, and I forgot, yes.
Thanks again, Walter. Always a pleasure to be here. Yours off.
Yeah.
Are we okay?
Yeah.
Everybody here? Okay. Hear the war drums in the background. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a nice turnout today. This is great. Good afternoon, and our panel is going to zero in some of the things that have already been mentioned, but I think we need to go into a little bit more detail. The cyber and information war between Ukraine and Russia. And we have three panelists, and they're among the leading experts in the field. Mark Montgomery from the Center for Cyber and Technology Innovation in Washington. Greg Melcher, who will be online from Vienna, I believe. From the Center for the Study of New Generation Warfare, and Marcus Kolga in Ottawa, Canada, not USA, Ottawa, Canada. But anyway, before I hand over to our panelists, I'm going to raise a few points. Walter told me I can have a bit of time to say what I want to. I'll raise a few points on Ukraine's crucial information offensive. What needs to be done? Because what we've noticed is that the longer that Russia is failing to gain significant ground in eastern Ukraine and is unable to regain, this is very important, unable to regain its own territory, areas of Kursk Oblast that were liberated by Ukrainian troops, the more that continues, the more Moscow relies on propaganda, disinformation, and social and political influence operations in the West. It needs to create an illusion of Russian success and Ukrainian failure in order to convince Western leaders that Russia is invincible, as James said a few moments ago, and that helping Ukraine militarily is futile. Not only costly, but futile. To counter this defeatist narrative, Ukraine needs strong and persuasive messages in both word and deed. When I was learning about propaganda when I was in college many years ago, the propaganda of the deed is even more important than the propaganda of the word. And I'll mention this in my remarks. Ukraine's battlefield operations must consolidate perceptions that Russia's defeat is desirable, evidential, and inevitable. Such an information offensive impacts on morale, belief, commitment, leadership, and outcome, and it influences Western policy. Kiev must be more effective in three key narratives by demonstrating that the Russian army is beatable, that the Russian state is brittle, and that there are credible alternatives to an imperial Russia. First, Ukraine needs to consistently highlight its successful decimation of Russia's military and war economy, and that such actions actually shorten the war. It has largely incapacitated Russia's Black Sea Fleet and intensified attacks on Russia's domestic infrastructure, especially energy targets that fuel the war. Margarita is going to talk a little bit more about this in the next panel. Ukraine drone strikes have proved effective in long-distance bombing operations, hitting fuel terminals, oil refineries, pipelines, and ports. As a result, Moscow's gasoline exports are dropping sharply, and the damage is exacerbated by tighter international sanctions. Ukrainian drone strikes have several positive informational repercussions. They demonstrate that Russia is becoming more vulnerable, as much of its air defense system has been destroyed or deployed in Ukraine. They showcase the growing sophistication of Ukraine's drone warfare, which can precisely hit targets several hundred kilometers, if not more, inside Russia. Moreover, bombing campaigns reduce the supply of equipment and fuel for Russia's occupation forces in Ukraine. And paradoxically, the Kremlin remains largely silent about Ukraine's attacks inside Russia, or blames them on accidents or falling debris. It fears revealing its own weaknesses and acknowledging Ukraine's successes, as this deflates the propaganda swallowed by much of the Western media that Russia is invincible. However, the paradox again, not admitting to declining war capacities because of attacks on its territory, also contradicts Moscow's propaganda narrative of a dangerous escalation because of Ukrainian attacks that will precipitate World War III, a myth designed to petrify Western leaders. Oh, I thought you'd give me marks again. Sorry if I... Second, Kiev needs to consistently demonstrate that the Russian state is brittle, whether disclosing its financial problems, economic decline, or social discontent. Russia faces deep structural difficulties with over-reliance on energy exports and the pursuit of a war economy at the cost of the civilian sector. International sanctions are also biting harder than Russian officials have admitted, by reducing Moscow's access to foreign technology and markets. Russia is depleting its financial reserves, accumulating during periods of high energy prices, and is unable to borrow on international financial markets. In a country where more than half the population lives directly off state subsidies, the cost of living is rising with rampant inflation, declining social services, and shortages of an increasing range of products. As the economy declines and sanctions tighten, some economists are even warning that the Russian population could sooner or later turn against the regime. All these information grenades need to be bombarded with Western governments, media, and social networks. Third, two more points. Ukrainian officials and analysts must also demonstrate that there are credible alternatives to an imperial Russia. Despite the Kremlin narrative to frighten the West, Moscow's defeat does not mean chaos and international instability. Ukraine's army already incorporates anti-regime Russian, Chechen, and newly formed nomad contingent that includes recruits from Kalmykia, Tatarstan, Bashkortostan, Sakha, and other non-Russian nationalities. These are important demonstrations of an anti-Muscovite internationalism. Ukraine has also positioned itself as at the forefront of a developing movement to weaken Russian imperialism, to weaken it from within by supporting a host of national and regional groups seeking independence from Moscow. This support for this neo-Prometheist approach, neo-Prometheus strategy, must be intensified and internationalized. My very last point, Kiev must remain astute in dealing with the Trump administration. It must assert that it wants a ceasefire to help end the war, to welcome Washington's mediation, but also to point out that it is Russia that is constantly breaking agreements, opposing peacekeepers, escalating hostilities, attacking civilians, and seizing resources that Trump wants for America. Above all, Trump must be convinced that if he accedes to Moscow's territorial demands in Ukraine, he will go down in history as a weak loser. And if Trump loses to Russia, this will encourage other expansionist powers such as China, and is much more likely to pull America into a future war. The only way to deal with Russia is to demonstrate that you are militarily stronger and victorious. So enough said, I'll stop there. Each panelist will have, I think, about 10 minutes, so we can open up as much as possible for questions. So 10 minutes to outline your points, and then we'll divide the rest of the time between questions and answers. So let's begin with Mark Montgomery, Center for Cyber and Technology Information.
All right, thank you. Yeah, I'm Mark Montgomery. I'm a retired Navy admiral. I do training. A group of us general officers do training in Ukraine for Ukrainian forces. However, not on cyber. So this is coming totally from my review of the issue, not from personal experience in Ukraine. I will say that much like conventional warfare, and you reviewed it very well, Janice, that whether it's missile defense, drones, maritime, undersea, unmanned surface vessels, this war has really had a significant impact on how the global cybersecurity landscape is looked at and how we think about cyber and warfare. And it starts from the very first night, as we know, with a reasonably well integrated Russian strike on telecommunications, cyber strike on telecommunications timed with their large-scale ground offensive, but has continued beyond that. I think it's worth understanding just how comprehensive the Russian cyber campaign against Ukraine is. I mean, it is, we would call it in the States, the kitchen sink of attacks. It's everything you can think of. The most important of which, the most jarring of which, are the critical infrastructure attacks on power grids, telecommunications, and energy supply systems. When married with the missile defense attacks, it has a significant ability to conduct widespread disruptive events. It's timed for seasonal challenges like the winter, most importantly, but the critical infrastructure attacks are number one. Number two has been the data extraction and espionage against government agencies, defense contractors, NATO supporting organizations within Ukraine. They use this for both military intelligence, but also for propaganda, the information they pull out. They later use, and I'll talk about that, information operations in a second. The third area is destructive malware. They've developed two unique wiper malwares during this campaign that try to turn systems inoperative at an appropriate time, really paralyzing government options, some infrastructures. The fourth one is ransomware, the old traditional, a Russian go-to, ransomware, and in this case, they disguise it as hacktivism, and it's used against Ukrainian businesses, usually with some false political statement attached to it. The fifth is distributed denial of service attacks. This goes back in Ukraine to 2014, 2015, but they're still using them against government websites with the idea of paralyzing communications between the government and its citizenry. And then finally, and one that really feeds into information operations, is a comprehensive phishing social engineering campaign targeting government and military personnel with the idea of developing data for use in information operations campaigns against them. Some of the Russian teams have become so sophisticated during this, they've risen to the level of an advanced persistent threat. So the Sandworm teams now, I think known as APT-44 in the U.S. parlance. In any case, this is, as I said, a full-scale cyber war being conducted against the Ukrainian infrastructure, government system, and population. I'd also say it's combined with a cognitive warfare effort that looks to manipulate public perceptions and opinion. There's a timing of attacks, the timing of the release of information done in a way to try to undermine the rule of law and the credibility of the government. It is, for academics, I suppose it will be an interesting campaign to study. It was broadly seen in the first 6 months of the war as an unsophisticated effort by Russia. I think that analysis has changed, and there's more of an understanding that it is, while it may not be organized the way the United States would organize a cyber campaign, it has a quality due to its quantity of its own, and we have to acknowledge that. Which really means that the Atlantic response has to be significant. And I do want to give a lot of credit. First, I worked for Senator John McCain when I retired from the military, and I want to recognize that the Ukrainian cyber attaché, came in and briefed us in 2017, left the normal, fairly compelling, we're under attack from, in the winter from these cyber attacks, and McCain was smart enough and skilled enough and manipulative enough to get a plug of money, about $50 million, and then went over to Munich when the security conferences and convinced the Europeans to kick in about 35 million of their own. And that, in my mind, that we'll say $75–80 million worth of cybersecurity assistance was critical to the success. I would say it was a part of a broader Ukrainian success in building cyber resilience between 2018 and 2021. This same comprehensive cyber attack against the United States would be brutal and bring us to if it was done on the scale of the United States, bring us to our knees. But when executed against Ukraine, it has had only moderate impact, and in some areas, much less than expected. I also want to acknowledge that since the start of the war, over the last 16 months, the Tallinn mechanism has been an excellent Atlantic effort to bring together, I think, 11 countries and 2 organizations, NATO and the EU, along with Canada, Denmark, France, Estonia, UK, the normal crowd, I think Germany, Italy, Sweden, the Netherlands, I think. So you get up to about 11 countries quickly. And I think a total of about $240 million at this point worth of contributions, mostly government, but there's some private sector contributions in there. I'll make it, don't worry. And it provides not just public and private support, but hardware and software, upgrades, technology, patching, endpoint detection, incident response programs, a way to suss out malware, and a good chunk of it has to do with preserving satellite communications. That $250 million has been critical. The one thing I'll say is it gets burned down as given, which means it has to continue. So the degree to which the U.S. government funds that went to this are in any way restrained right now, the other Europeans need to pick this up. This is a small portion. $250 million is a small portion of the overall, if you listen to our president, $500 billion. If you listen to anyone logical, $138 billion maybe 125, 140 billion dollars of European support. That 270 billion, 280 billion. This is 215 million. You know, you don't have to be a mathematician to know that's about 0.1%, right? So of that 0.1%, it's got to continue. We get a lot of bang for that cyber buck. And so the Tallinn mechanisms efforts need to, they do have three good lines of effort, and they're going to have to, if they don't have enough money, the three are support, build, and sustain. That's immediate, midterm, long-term. They're going to have to focus on the immediate. And that just creates downstream challenges when you haven't done the midterm and long-term cybersecurity investments. So we've got to keep that money flowing. I know the countries are looking at how you cover down, but that, you know, that's been over 15 months. If you think 230, 240 million, that's about 200 million a year. We've got to make sure that still flows in. If that does, I think that plus the strong domestic cyber resilience efforts of the Ukrainian government, businesses, and citizenry are going to leave us in a good position, one that can continue to respond to this comprehensive kitchen sink Russian attack effort. So I leave you like with the idea that, yes, they're a bad adversary, as they are in every other way, but yes, Ukrainian resilience has come through during this with Atlantic support, and it just needs to continue. So with that, Janice, I'll pass it back.
Great. I've got a question, but I'll leave it until afterwards. Thanks very much, Mark. We now go over to Europe. Greg, I think you're in Vienna, right? Can you hear me?
I can. I just had to turn on my mic. I'm actually in Brno, Czechia. I've got something at the Defense University here tomorrow.
Okay, very good. Greg, the floor is yours, or the airwaves are yours.
Okay, I may break your 10 minutes, so tell me if I'm going too long and I'll stop. Okay. Today, given the topic in the 10 minutes, I thought I'd start by discussing a bit about the Russian approach to special ops and perhaps implications for Ukraine based on a regional study underway that I know of in an Eastern European country. Then some thoughts and recommendations for Ukraine SOF based on a few experts I've been in touch with, which I'll leave unnamed as well. And clearly there's more to say about SOF, but I don't think we can really talk about it in a forum like this. I believe we face two fronts against our adversary here in Europe. And I think I heard sense of that in the little bit I've heard tonight. Is one is, of course, the physical front that we're dealing with in Russia, and then the second front in the information and cognitive domain. And I think in this case, we may well have already lost that war and didn't even know we were in it, or at least some of us didn't. Recently, I spent some time focusing on information warfare. I went out to a U.S.-Taiwan exercise late last year, and that was pretty interesting to see how they're dealing with similar things from China in terms of information and narrative attacks. And I've been working on an IW wargame approach for another different Eastern European country. And that leads me to a few thoughts on how we're going to try and organize that and some tools we think that need to be built that don't really exist. So I've learned a lot of war games along these lines that, you know, go between the classic war fading and then get into what I call non-kinetic, or you might call hybrid or gray zone or cyber or soft, terrorist, that kind of thing. So first, let's talk about Russian SOF. And I forgot to start my clock. Or Spetsnaz. This capability was in deep decline after the fall of the Soviet Union, but a resurgence really began around the 2008 operation in Georgia. Russian SOF roles at the strategic level include advising, providing support and influence operations, special reconnaissance, and even assassinations, typically executed from personnel out of their KSSO or Special Forces Command. At the operational tactical level, the focus is on special reconnaissance, raids and sabotage, UAV, UAS support to ground troops, and protection of key infrastructure and other assets. Most units, that's not just protection, it's also attack on those infrastructure. Most units report to the General Staff, to the GRU. Right now they have 8 Special Forces Brigade for ground forces, 4 for maritime forces. And normally you're looking at somewhere between 15 and 20,000 troops. And I'll say something about what that means today. To this, you add the VDV, Russia's airborne forces, and they're rumored with plans to expand from the current brigade size to a division, which makes sense when you look at their plans as they exercised back in Zapad 21. Russian combat potential modeling shows they really can't beat the West head-to-head against our more advanced capabilities on a typical European battlefield. This is a general staff run operation. And we'll need those airborne capabilities to go deep behind our lines and cut off our supply. They expect to lose that first engagement, but will use these airborne forces to aid in success of the typical Russian encirclement strategy. So you're going to see them putting a high priority on growing that capability in SOF. The reality today, though, of Russian SOF staffing level is much lower than this, as they were heavily used in some areas of the conflict. And you'll recall that Putin ran the special military operation through the GRU leadership, not the general staff. So SOF forces got very heavy use, particularly the ground-focused ones, and they suffered a lot of casualties. Rebuilding these special forces will take from 4 to 6 years, typical training time to really get a good person. However, that's pretty well timed with when Russia is predicted to fully reconstitute for their losses, assuming the war comes to an end somewhere in the near future. Last, of course, then you have the overall Special Forces Command. That's kind of a tier 1 to equivalent to tier 1 Western forces. They got about 2,000 people there roughly. We've observed in the war the KSSO's focus on special reconnaissance for air and battle damage assessment. Direct action for high priority targets and clearing operations, support and influence ops, and again, UAV, UAS support to the ground troops. An outsider's assessment is that they are well integrated with the ground troops, but they have suffered high losses in this GRU-driven war, and will probably be in better shape in the maritime battalions, which we haven't been as heavily used. So that's kind of where they are. Now, in terms of Ukrainian SOF, I think it's important that they continue to maintain and expand relationships in and outside their own organizations. I'm putting this together from experts who are in the know more than I am. The challenge with SOF generally is they got too specialized, too focused on security, and too elitist. They don't often do outreach to conventional forces or other organizations that they need to support and enable their organizations. U.S. SOF learned this the hard way in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere that they needed to lean heavily on the conventional forces working in the same battle space, and that they need to develop close and mutually supporting relationships with interagency partners across the U.S. This was a big mindset change, not just for the U.S. SOF, but also for the other organizations supporting SOF, many of whom may not even understand the mission. These are the points that should be emphasized with Ukraine SOF, especially as I continue to hear of the organizational dysfunction of the Ukrainian government. Probably Ukraine SOF understand this, but it's not clear that they fully embrace the concept, and formal feedback indicates the Ukrainian SOF is doing well. It's hopeful that they're leveraging all the resources at their disposal. This includes not just outreach inside Ukraine, but also with NATO allies supporting Ukraine's defense. Of course, sadly, the U.S. has not been able to support this cooperation on the ground. The last administration would not allow it. Of course, we're all puzzled about what will or will not be allowed by the current administration. Perhaps U.S. SOF presence will be allowed in part of whatever NATO EU mission is created to screw Ukraine if the war is stopped. Personally, you've probably talked about this already, but I don't think Putin is going to allow such a presence as part of any settlement. But anyway, that's probably a discussion you're going to be doing there today. Meanwhile, other European SOF forces have been operating discreetly in Ukraine, and I think to great effect there. In many ways, Ukraine SOF, to include conventional elements of their military, are the most experienced battlefield fighters in the world at this point, especially against an advanced near-peer military. Western countries need to ensure we're capturing, studying, and adapting to Russian tactics. This in particular critical in the communications jamming domain, but also against missile drone cyber capabilities being used. It appears the Ukraine SOF have remained focused on SOF missions and are not wandering into roles that are not suited or resourced to do, especially not attempting to take on traditional ground warfare roles. Often SOF will find it hard to resist the pull to gravitate to missions beyond their scope. And by the way, the Russian SOF definitely made that mistake, and that's one of the reasons why they lost so many. Ukrainian SOF needs to ensure that they have a post-war plan. If peace follows, how do they transition? If occupation of some kind happens, what do they do? These challenges are particularly relevant today with the status of peace plans quite unresolved and what sort of guarantees Ukraine might get. As discussed, Russia has quite a robust Spetsnaz, or at least will once reconstituted, and I can't imagine they won't be very active behind Ukraine lines, regardless of whatever peace agreement is negotiated. Even more worrisome could be the U.S. and Russia agreeing, but Ukraine and Europe not. So who knows where that's going to go. Okay, looks like I have enough time to do my last one. Information warfare. So a few comments on that, where I'm trying to do some advanced wargaming to reflect the actual environment being faced by government and industry. So I'm kind of blending between what governments want, and I'm talking to some leading industry folks that are involved in this area. The goal is to, they're trying to do is to justify the need just not to improve processes and coordination, but also the need to invest in building world-leading tools that will help keep pace with the evolving threats. I want to be able to justify these information warfare investments, just as I often do in kinetic war games, showing the need for increased capabilities in conventional warfare, for example, more tanks or helicopters or whatnot. So this game I'm trying to set up would assess how a country, or it could be done at a company level too, how they use their existing capabilities to counter an adversary influence operation campaign. And then the game would be rerun with the new improved capabilities to include a centralized intelligence discovery and analysis platform. The dimensions of information warfare threat would typically include covert and overt influence operations, the intersection of covert and overt technical signals and tradecraft. I'd expect to identify gaps in areas such as slow detection of new narratives, weak synergy across the agencies. And this turns out really to be the #1 problem that was identified by the country I'm working with. Limited data correlation or partial attribution, and all resulting in a quite fragmented communication strategy to the public. And you can really see that in a few of the governments I've been talking to. A second run of the game would assume the existence of the centralized intelligence discovery and analysis platform. And let me say up front, this doesn't exist, and you probably really can't quite build it, but you could maybe, at this point, technologically, I think you could probably get 2/3 of the way there. But these capabilities would include things like web scraping and monitoring, network, hypergraph analysis, AI narrative tracking, and a centralized intelligence library, and some sort of chat GPT-like functionality in order to do the right queries and be able to use it. And maybe that would get updated with some of the stuff we're finding now in DeepSeek. Feedback I've received from Ukraine indicates quite a struggle between all the agencies of government to function against the IW cognitive attacks, being, as I think Mark just mentioned, relentlessly launched against them by Russia and its surrogates. And developing such a tool would not just help them become far more effective, a tool like this could also be used to share with the allies operating in support of Ukraine. The benefits would be numerous, but more important to quickly identify, counter, and move quickly to produce effective stratcom in Ukraine and elsewhere. I view that as an improved offensive capability as I go back to my original comments. Since I see these areas as no different than conventional war. It's still attacks, it's still war. And that's it. Thank you for your time. Happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Thanks very much. Thanks very much. Thanks for staying on time. We'll go over to Marcus.
Great. The mic is working. Excellent. Thank you, Janusz. The last time Janusz and I were on a panel together, I think it was November in Ottawa, our panel the entire event made international headlines. Unfortunately, not because of our panel, but for a Russian agent who had infiltrated the event and was exposed a few days later. So it's good to see you again, Janusz.
It was me.
Jaku, Walter, and the entire committee for inviting me here today. My name is Markus Kolga. I'm a Canadian of Estonian heritage. I've been monitoring and writing about Russian information influence operations targeting Canada and our allies for the past 15 years or so. And I'm one of 3 Canadians to be sanctioned both by Russia and China. Exactly. Well, in the U.S. Well, wait until my presentation is over. Let me begin by saying that over the past 3 years, Ukraine and the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States and Canada have fought valiantly and very effectively in the information space, countering Russian information warfare both at home and abroad. But the rapid escalation of pro-Kremlin and anti-Ukrainian influence in Western information spaces and its growing impact on public opinion and policy should concern us all. Andre, if you can give it a click. In recent weeks, Russia has scored major victories, yielding a significant return on its investment in information warfare against Ukraine and the West. And that investment is significant. According to Lithuania's debunk.org, Russia allocated $1.6 billion in 2023 alone to spread pro-Kremlin propaganda and disinformation both domestically and internationally. They've invested in supporting far left and far right political movements, groups, and parties throughout the democratic world. And we've seen this in Germany, Italy, and Austria and beyond. They invest in groups and influencers who act as proxies to legitimize and amplify Russian narratives, especially those that are critical of Ukraine and NATO. It appears now that the Kremlin has convinced some in the United States that Vladimir Putin should be rewarded and with normalized relations and the potential lifting of sanctions. But the United States is not alone. Our other allies and nations in the developing world are also falling victim to these operations. Now, in a word, Russia is winning the information war in the Western world. Andre, if you can click. So how is Russia succeeding? Well, we now have unprecedented insight into Russia's strategic objectives and tactics, thanks to an FBI affidavit unsealed in September of 2024, focusing on Russia's doppelganger disinformation campaign. The affidavit contains minutes from top secret meetings between Vladimir Putin's senior advisor, Sergei Kirienko, and 3 Russian communications firms, Social Design Agency, Struktura National Technology, and A&O Dialogue. These documents detail the Kremlin's information warfare playbook against Ukraine, NATO, and the Western world. And the primary objectives of these operations are to first undermine Ukrainian morale, to erode Western support for Ukraine and NATO, to exploit divisions within and between Western nations, to manufacture conflict where none existed through disinformation and deepfakes, and to deploy an army of Western social media influencers acting as amplifiers to legitimize and spread Kremlin narratives. Now, since COVID-19, we've witnessed these tactics deployed with increasing sophistication. In Canada, Kremlin-aligned narratives evolved from anti-vaccine disinformation to supporting the Ottawa trucker convoy protests in early 2022. And they then seamlessly transitioned into anti-Ukrainian rhetoric by early March of 2022. One Canadian group, initially at the forefront of anti-vaccine protests, became a key amplifier of the trucker protests before pivoting to anti-Ukrainian messaging, going so far as to cite and even repost Russian embassy statements. Russia also used state media like RT to platform illiberal, populist politicians, extremist activists on both the far left and far right, and to amplify fringe elements during moments of domestic unrest, many of whom amplify anti-Ukrainian narratives. Now, these tactics exploit one of the key vulnerabilities in Western society, which is our inability to detect Russian disinformation narratives. If you could click, Andre. Now, last summer, Disinfo Watch, which I run in Canada, in partnership with McGill University, we set out to measure Canadian vulnerability and susceptibility to Russian disinformation about Ukraine. We surveyed over 2,000 Canadians about leading Russian anti-Ukrainian disinformation narratives, and the results were pretty concerning. We found that 71% of Canadians reported encountering at least one Russian disinformation narrative. 48% believed or were unsure of whether NATO or Ukraine started the war. 70% of those who were exposed to false claims about corruption and the sale of weapons donated to Ukraine on the black market either believed them or were unaware of their validity. The study also revealed how political partnership plays into susceptibility to political partisanship plays into susceptibility to Kremlin narratives. Conservative voters who reported the highest exposure levels were also more likely to believe these narratives. They were more likely to believe these narratives than their liberal counterparts. For instance, only half of conservatives exposed to the Ukrainian Nazis narratives recognized it as being false. And I don't believe this is unique to Canada. So the Kremlin has effectively weaponized these vulnerabilities through its network of influencers, using ideological biases to entrench and expand anti-Ukrainian sentiment. These narratives, in turn, shape public opinion and threaten to influence policy decisions, as I believe we've been witnessing in the United States. Andre, if you don't mind clicking. Now, that network of influencers is one of the Kremlin's most effective tools for concealing its involvement and fabricating a facade of legitimacy. The September 2023 FBI affidavit also confirmed the importance of those influencers to those operations. It outlined how the Kremlin actively monitors and deploys an army of nearly 3,000 influencers on social media, many in the US and Canada, who either share the Kremlin's ideological goals or are financially incentivized to amplify their narratives. In September, the US Department of Justice also indicted 2 RT employees. RT has, of course, been identified as a key component of Russia's intelligence apparatus by the US, UK, and Canadian governments. The indictment disclosed an alleged Kremlin-backed scheme to fund the creation of a North American media operation with $10 million. This operation allegedly recruited well-known American and Canadian far-right influencers, paying them as much as $100,000 per podcast episode to push Kremlin-aligned content. In just a few months, videos produced by this group amassed over 16 million views on YouTube alone. Now, here is an example of one of those videos produced by Tenet Media. Andre, if you can play it. Wrong speaker.
Matters anymore. This is psychotic. Ukraine is the enemy of this country. Ukraine is our enemy, being funded by the Democrats. I will stress this again. One of the greatest enemies of our nation right now is Ukraine. They are expanding this war. Now, don't get me wrong. I know you've got criminal elements of the U.S. government pushing them and guiding them and telling them what to do. Ukraine is now accused, a German warrant issued for blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline, triggering this conflict. Ukraine is the greatest threat to this nation and to the world. We should rescind all funding and financing, pull out all military support, and we should apologize to Russia. They know it.
I mean, we can laugh at this, but this is very serious. Millions of Americans, Canadians, and others in the Western world are exposed to this kind of content. And this is only the tip of the iceberg. So with a well-financed army of influencers relentlessly bombarding millions of us with Kremlin-aligned disinformation and a public that's increasingly unable to critically assess it, it's no surprise that even some US officials are now repeating Kremlin talking points. Andre, if you can switch the slide. So with every success on the information battlefield, the Kremlin grows bolder and adds resources to expand their capabilities. We need to up our game to address this. Our response must be swift, strategic, and backed by the necessary resources to meet this growing threat. Ukraine cannot be expected to do this work alone. It requires Western support, the kind of work that the Global Engagement Center was tasked with, and the kind of work that the National Endowment for Democracy has been tasked by Congress to undertake. This includes support for Ukrainian media and independent Russian journalists who seek to deliver truth and facts to Russians inside of Russia to challenge and apply maximum pressure inside Russia's own information space. Furthermore, we cannot afford to simply continue to observe and just analyze the threat, what I call admiring the problem. We need to take coordinated action to disrupt Russia's influence operations, expose them, and develop effective tools for prevention and deterrence. This means greater transparency in our collective information spaces. It means scrutinizing and calling out the pro-Kremlin influencers and tightening FARA rules, not abandoning them. At a time when the U.S. government's support for these defensive measures is uncertain, it's critical for us to strengthen collaboration among North American civil society organizations, frontline defenders, independent media, and allied governments, including Ukraine, that remain resolute in defending democracy and securing the integrity of our information space. While we can't be certain about Donald Trump's intent in repeating false Russian claims about Ukraine to the world, we can be certain that they will impact public opinion. For a U.S. leader to do so is a historic victory for Russian information operations targeting Ukraine and the Western world, and it has to be challenged. I look forward to your questions.
Okay. Thanks very much. We have Walter, I think, about what, 10, 15 minutes? About that. Okay. Let me just ask the first question for, actually, I wrote it down for Mark, but maybe all three of you could take a stab at it. We've heard quite a bit about cyber defense, and as you pointed out, Marcus, calling out some of the bad actors, if you like, those that spread Russian disinformation. What has Ukraine actually done on the offensive side? In other words, not just to defend, Mark, you start talking about this, not only defending itself against some of these attacks, but also going on the offensive to affect the Russian information space, even if not at wide public level, within the elite level, which I've always thought is, somebody mentioned the Prigozhin rebellion. I think that is ripe territory for widening gaps, rifts, and disputes even between the Russian elites. So what has Ukraine done? What has it accomplished? What does it need to do in that sphere?
So first, I'll start by saying this is an unusual thing. Offensive cyber operations are the number of countries that acknowledge having programs is 3 or 4. The actual number that have them is 11 or 12. I mean, meaningful programs. And there's 3 that are 4 that are clearly above all others: United States, Israel, China, and Russia. And then a very significant drop till you get to the next. Now, having said that, the irony is, back when I was with Senator McCain, the Ukrainian attaché did ask for training on offensive cyber, and we didn't take it up. And we didn't take it up because, as a matter of practice and principle, we don't actually train, that we'll train other countries in all kinds of weapon systems. We don't actually train in offensive cyber, and the reason, there's a lot of reasons for it, where I'm confident we re-examine that slightly now for some of our closest allies. But it's very hard to share tools, because if you share a tool, unlike a air defense missile or something else, the tool may not be able to be reused by you if it's used by your partner or ally. Whereas if I shoot an AMRAAM missile, if a Ukrainian shoot an AMRAAM missile up at a Russian system, the next day the U.S. can shoot an AMRAAM against a Taiwan thing and not expect that the defensive response will be that much different. So it's a unique thing in offensive cyber. So in the absence of that, they have had a extremely ad hoc response with an IT army that has done a lot of hacktivism. It's done some actual critical infrastructure attacks. I would say 2 things limit it. One is, it is actually hard to develop the really sophisticated tools that are effective against critical infrastructure. There's some basic tools you can use against poorly defended infrastructure, but it is a little bit harder. And 2 is that there is one thing Ukraine has to be concerned about. They haven't shown any actual concern about it, but one of the things you tend to worry about when you have an offensive cyber capability is the law of unintended consequences and escalation dynamic when things are being done by people who are not really your own soldiers. But so far I have not seen the impact of that, mostly because, as was noted by one of the other speakers, the Russians tend to deny that the U.S. did the attack, or that the Ukrainians did the attack, that it was some kind of magical accident that happened at the exact wrong moment. So, I really think this, I don't want to say it's a lost opportunity, but the Ukrainians actually asked for help 3 years before the war. We made a conscious decision, as we did with every other country, and with the possible exception of maybe the UK, to not provide that assistance.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I don't know, Marcus, if you want to say a few words.
Well, I mean, just briefly on the information front, I think Ukraine and President Zelensky, the Ukrainian government, have been absolutely brilliant in terms of strategic communications from whose mic is doing that? Yeah,
I don't think
we are next door to the is it the ambassador's residence? Yeah, I was terrified to see that. Yes, that's a great idea. Right. Look, Zelensky and the Ukrainian government have been brilliant in terms of their stratcoms. It's why I believe Ukraine has been able to attract the kind of support and sustain support that it has throughout the Western world, and continues to attract in places like Canada and Europe. And I'd also say that it's not just the Ukrainian government and the Zelensky administration on its own. It is the diaspora. The diaspora groups like this one, UNIS, the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, those organizations and members of the diaspora have been critically important to keeping that focus on Ukraine. And I think that's really unique. I don't think that gets acknowledged enough. And I think that's something that will be looked into down the road in the future. Now, Janusz, you mentioned the Prigozhin rebellion and something about exploiting that. I think we all have to remember that Vladimir Putin was, as we've discussed already today, was on his back heels over the past few months. He's been thrown a lifeline by the United States. They have revitalized him in the eyes of Russians. They have normalized relations with him, and they've given him that the administration has given him the legitimacy that he so craves. We had a situation inside Russia where the civilian population was questioning the direction of the country. Oligarchs were questioning the direction that Vladimir Putin was taking the country in. That could have been exploited, but instead we have a situation where, again, I think Vladimir Putin's reputation has unfortunately been somewhat rehabilitated thanks to the current U.S. administration.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marcus. Let's go to questions one by one. And we're going to take several. If you could introduce yourself and your affiliation, and we'll go to the speakers.
Thank you very much. I am a Lithuanian diplomat, ambassador, agent of Belarus, currently with SIPA, Center for Europe Policy Analysis. My question is on the fight on disinformation. And this is where we talk now about the split between US and Europe on NATO, about support of Ukraine and many, but on disinformation. The backbone of EU efforts is the Digital Service Act, which is in essence, fact-checking, working with the platforms, insisting them to provide with how they act, how they cope with all these bots and trolls. Whereby, as we understand here in US, from one speech, but also from the fact that Mega Facebook is denouncing the previous fact-check efforts, so there will be no effort. So how we are going to cement our efforts, European and American, which is the backbone of transatlantic sort of efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's good. Please keep your questions short. The next person I saw is over here in the center with the beard. Keep going. There we go.
My question is that basically you've identified. Yes, I'm Bogdan Andrei Hitmansky with the Ukrainian American Veterans. You mentioned that the U.S., Russia, and China are one of the premier cyber warfare countries in the world, along with Israel, I believe. Is there any type of collaboration between Russia and China on cyber warfare tactics and TTPs being developed by Russia in Ukraine? And how does that translate for future warfare, possibly against the United States?
Yeah. I saw him next.
Thank you. Andrei Larionov, Center for Security Policy. Speaking about propaganda as information, I think it's very important this particular moment, after 2 weeks of enormous Putin's propaganda and disinformation about the size of US military aid to Ukraine, ranging from $350 billion from the current US president to $100 billion from the current Ukrainian president, to state clearly and loudly that based on US government official data, total US military aid shipped to Ukraine over 3 years was $27 billion, which means $9 billion on average per year. So that I think it's very important that not only Kremlin, we would not repeat Kremlin's propaganda, we would have as close as possible to official US government data that is available on sites of Pentagon and states and Department of State.
Thanks very much. And the flip side of that, how American defense industry has been benefited from that money. Last question, and then I'm going to go to the speakers. This lady here.
Hi, my name is Natalia Kuchar, and I'm representing UKK. So I have this question. What our US cybersecurity is doing about counteracting Russian propaganda here? We know now that X owned by our government official now, Elon Musk, and himself is sharing Russian propaganda talking points, not only here, but worldwide.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, with those questions, let's start with Mark.
Right,
You
I'll
can
take
answer
I'll
any
take the
of-
two cyber ones. So
Yeah.
Russia-China collaboration in cyber is very limited. We're doing a axis of authoritarian study at FDD that looks at collaboration in economic, military, nuclear, and cyber. The area of least cooperation is cyber. This has to do with an unwillingness to share tools, an unwillingness to share access that generally occurs between these organizations. This is much different than, say, sharing of ballistic missile parts, sharing of drone technology, sharing of fighter weapons that are used in war, and then economic, like oil and things like that, but, foreign direct investment, things like that. So cyber really is the lowest level of cooperation between all the authoritarians, North Korea, Iran, Russia, and China. On the issue of U.S. cybersecurity countering, so to be clear, we had a very effective system under what's called National Security Presidential Memorandum 13, actually signed by President Trump, that allowed for countering Russian disinformation efforts in the 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024 elections. It worked very well. I would say that, unfortunately, the Trump administration has come in and removed almost all the disinformation teams at the teams that look for disinformation everywhere in the world, overseas and domestically, in a mistaken effort to remove what they felt was a domestic censorship effort. In other words, there may have been I don't think there was, but I'll stipulate maybe there was a domestic censorship effort. That should have nothing to do with working overseas efforts by Russia and China overseas to create disinformation about the United States. But they got rid of the teams at state, actually hold state for a second, at Justice, FBI, and CISA. And then at State Department, it wasn't the Trump administration, but the Congress allowed the authorization for the Global Engagement Center to expire. So we have successfully neutered our own efforts in this, and it will make us a weaker country in terms of dealing with both disinformation overseas and disinformation domestically.
Okay, Marcus, and then Greg, we haven't forgotten about you, so you'd be off.
Okay, just very briefly, expanding on Mark's remarks, he's absolutely right. It's really unfortunate, but in the past 2 months, the United States has really just ended all of their efforts to push back on disinformation. But this also includes USAID, their support for these amazing Ukrainian organizations that really have been innovative in detecting and challenging Russian information narratives. That funding is all gone. There are thousands of brilliant Ukrainians now that are forced to do this work on a volunteer basis, with the hope that funding for USAID their projects will be reinstated, and that the funding through NED will start flowing again. This is extremely important. And two other points on the question about China-Russia coordination on disinformation. We're seeing it happen. We are seeing coordination specifically in Canada right now. We have our former Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, a member of the Ukrainian-Canadian diaspora, who is running for the leadership of the Liberal Party and to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. She is being targeted over the past 3 weeks or so with narratives in the Chinese media that reflect those same ones that have been used by Russia, accusing her of being a Nazi whitewasher, a Ukrainian neo-Nazi, and such, in efforts to try and manipulate the outcome of that election. And then the final point to the ambassador about the DSA, thank you to Europe for passing this important legislation. I fear that it won't have too much impact, given the fact that Twitter and Facebook have ended, as you mentioned, all moderation in the United States, and Twitter itself was not complying with DSA as it was. So when I get to ask this question in Canada, what should Canada do? I mean, there's no point in regulating anymore. None of these companies will comply with any of those regulations. I tell people just stay off those platforms.
Very good. Greg, you have the last word.
Okay, just two quick points. One is that I think our efforts in encountering this information, frankly, were pretty weakly funded to begin with. I mean, the GEC is nothing like what we used to have in 1999 when USIA was eliminated. And really, if we're really going to compete in this stage of the world, we have to recognize that's the type of involvement that's required, and it's substantially larger than that. The other is, given the turn in our government here in the US, I don't see any solution other than just EU is going to have to step in and help Ukraine fund and take aggressive actions in Stratcom to counter these messages and to go back, whether it's Macron on the stage correcting Trump to his face, or a constant barrage of messaging that puts the truth out there to counter the misinformation that unfortunately is coming out of our leadership at this point. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Greg. Thank you to all the panelists. My very last word, an information war is never lost. We may lose battles, but the war is not lost. And like Ukraine, ще не вмерла Ukraina, the information war against Russia hasn't yet fully matured, and it's going. You have to look at the victory, not a potential defeat. Thank you.
Do I get this?
We backed out.